Welcome to the End of Reason podcast, where we dive deep into the world of film and storytelling. I'm your host, C.R. Knight, and today we're taking on one of the most iconic psychological thrillers of all time, The Silence of the Lambs. This film, directed by Jonathan Demme, is a masterclass in tension, character development, and psychological horror. It won 5 Oscars, including Best Picture, and gave us 2 of the most chilling characters in cinema history. Hannibal Lecter, played by the legendary Sir Anthony Hopkins, and Clarice Starling, portrayed by the brilliant Jodie Foster. So grab your fava beans and a nice Chianti. We're about to dissect this movie in detail. We'll talk about everything: the film's major themes, its influence on the genre, the performances, and its lasting cultural impact. And as always, I'll be asking you to send in your thoughts, questions, and favorite moments throughout the show. Let's get started. For anyone who hasn't seen The Silence of the Lambs, though I imagine most of you have, let me give you a quick rundown of the plot. The film follows Clarice Starling, a young FBI trainee, as she's tasked with helping track down a serial killer known as Buffalo Bill, who's been kidnapping and murdering women. To do this, she's asked to seek the insight of Hannibal Lecter, a former psychiatrist and convicted cannibalistic serial killer who's currently imprisoned. What unfolds is a psychological game of cat and mouse between Clarice and Lecter, as Clarice attempts to get Lecter's help while Lecter toys with her mind. The movie is based on the 1988 novel of the same name by Thomas Harris, and its plot is essentially a race against time, as Clarice has to catch Buffalo Bill before he claims another victim. But beyond the surface, The Silence of the Lambs is about far more than just a hunt for a killer. It explores power dynamics, trauma, and the nature of fear, all set against the backdrop of a society that often underestimates its female protagonist. Let's start by breaking down some key elements of the plot and how they work to create such an unsettling atmosphere. The dynamic of power and control is perhaps the most prominent theme in The Silence of the Lambs. It's seen in almost every interaction, especially between Clarice and Hannibal Lecter. From the very beginning, it's clear that Lecter is in control of their conversations, even though he's physically imprisoned. His ability to read people, manipulate them, and get inside their heads is what makes him so terrifying. The film cleverly sets up these power plays, not only between Lecter and Clarice, but also between Buffalo Bill and his victims, and between Clarice and the male-dominated world of law enforcement. One of the most powerful scenes in this regard is when Clarice first meets Lecter. She's told by her superiors to maintain control, but Lecter immediately flips the script. Through just a few sentences, he manages to get under her skin and make her feel vulnerable. Despite being behind glass, he's the one in charge. What's fascinating here is that in many ways, Clarice is fighting not just to solve the case, but to gain power in a world that constantly seeks to strip it away from her. This theme resonates on multiple levels and gives the film its unique tension. Another core theme is the exploration of evil, particularly in the characters of Hannibal Lecter and Buffalo Bill. Lecter is depicted as almost a refined, cultured kind of evil. He's not just a killer, he's a genius, charming, and even likable in a twisted way. His evil is intellectual, making him a far more complex and disturbing character. Then there's Buffalo Bill, who represents a more chaotic, destructive form of evil. He's horrifying in his brutality and his detachment from humanity. The film forces us to confront the fact that evil can take many forms. Sometimes it's calculated and articulate like Lecter, and other times it's messy and visceral like Buffalo Bill. But what's scarier? A mind like Lecter's, capable of understanding and manipulating human psychology to the point of controlling people's lives, or the sheer violence and unpredictability of someone like Buffalo Bill. Let's pause here for a second. I'd love to hear from you. Which portrayal of evil do you find more terrifying? Another major theme worth discussing is gender and how it plays into the power dynamics of the film. Clarice Starling's character is a groundbreaking role in many ways. She's a woman trying to navigate a male-dominated world, both in the FBI and in her interactions with Hannibal Lecter. Throughout the film, there's a clear subtext about how men underestimate her, whether it's her fellow officers, her superiors, or even Lecter at times. But despite being in these oppressive environments, Clarice never backs down. There's a scene where she's in an elevator surrounded by much taller, broader men, and it's clear that she's an outsider. But instead of being defeated by that, she uses it as fuel. She remains focused on her goal, and in many ways, her resilience is what ultimately allows her to succeed. Buffalo Bill's character also ties into this theme. His obsession with transforming himself by literally skinning his female victims speaks to a darker commentary on identity and gender. It's a twisted perversion of the idea of becoming something other than what society dictates. The film doesn't shy away from showing the horrifying lengths someone might go to in order to assert control over their own identity, and that's part of what makes it so disturbing. There's a lot to unpack here, so let's take a moment to reflect. What are your thoughts on how The Silence of the Lambs handles gender and power dynamics? Is Clarice Starling one of the best female protagonists in film history? I think so, but I'd love to hear your take. Now, let's move on to what really drives this film: the characters. At the heart of The Silence of the Lambs are two of the most iconic figures in cinema: Hannibal Lecter and Clarice Starling. Their relationship is what makes this film unforgettable, so let's break it down. Hannibal Lecter. What can I say about this character that hasn't already been said? Anthony Hopkins' portrayal is nothing short of chilling. What's so fascinating about Lecter is that he's not a typical villain. He's a sophisticated, almost gentlemanly figure who's capable of the most unspeakable acts. Hopkins' performance is magnetic. He's on screen for only about 16 minutes, yet he completely dominates the film. That's the mark of a truly iconic character. One of the reasons Lecter is so terrifying is his intellect. He's always 10 steps ahead, even when he's behind bars. The way he dissects people psychologically is far more frightening than any physical threat he poses. There's a moment when Lecter tells Clarice, "You fly back to school now, little Starling," and it's such a simple line, but the way Hopkins delivers it gives you chills. It's not just what he says, but how he says it. The calm, collected way he speaks, knowing that he has the upper hand. And we can't forget the iconic "I ate his liver with some fava beans" and a nice Chianti line. It's so casual, so off-handed, and that's what makes it so disturbing. Lecter doesn't revel in his violence. He sees it as an art form, something refined and almost banal in its cruelty. But what's most interesting about Lecter is his relationship with Clarice. He respects her in a way he doesn't respect others. He's intrigued by her, not just because she's an FBI agent, but because of her past, her trauma, her determination. There's a twisted sort of admiration there, and that dynamic is what keeps us glued to their scenes together. Then there's Clarice Starling. Jodie Foster gives a performance that's understated yet incredibly powerful. What makes Clarice such a compelling character is her vulnerability, which she doesn't try to hide, but instead uses as a strength. Throughout the film, we see Clarice struggle against the forces that want to diminish her, whether it's her male colleagues, her superior, or even Hannibal Lecter. But what's fascinating is that Clarice is not portrayed as a superhuman character. She's smart and brave, but she's also deeply affected by the violence and the horrors around her. We see her wince, we see her afraid, and we see her questioning herself. This vulnerability makes her relatable and grounded in reality. One of the standout aspects of Clarice's character is her relationship with her own past. Her memories of her father's death and the metaphorical lambs she couldn't save as a child provide insight into why she's so driven to solve the case. These personal stakes add an emotional layer to her pursuit of Buffalo Bill. Clarice is not just doing her job, she's trying to quiet the screaming lambs, the haunting voices from her past that fuel her desire to bring justice and save the innocent. Jodie Foster's nuanced performance captures both the strength and fragility of Clarice. She doesn't overplay the role, and that's key. Clarice isn't some untouchable action hero. She's a woman fighting tooth and nail in a world where she's constantly underestimated. And it's precisely this tension, her intelligence and determination versus the doubting forces around her, that makes her such a compelling character. I'd like to hear your opinion. What did you think of Jodie Foster's portrayal of Clarice? Do you think the film would have worked with anyone else in the role? Now let's talk about Buffalo Bill, the other key figure in the film. Portrayed by Ted Levine, Buffalo Bill is one of the most disturbing and complex villains in movie history. The character is unsettling not just because of what he does, kidnapping and skinning women, but because of the deep psychological issues that drive his actions. Buffalo Bill's desire to transform himself into something other reflects his fractured sense of identity. The film doesn't glorify his violence, but it does explore the psychology behind it. He's not just killing for pleasure, he's trying to become something else, and in the most grotesque way possible. This makes him both terrifying and tragically pathetic. His basement, with its sewing equipment and pit where he keeps his victims, becomes a nightmarish manifestation of his twisted psyche. One of the most memorable scenes, of course, is when Buffalo Bill performs his infamous dance, tucking his genitals between his legs while wearing a robe made of human skin. It's an incredibly disturbing moment, but it also serves as a window into his internal struggle. He's desperately trying to create a new identity, to mold himself into something other than what he is. The horror here is not just in the physical violence, but in the psychological torment that fuels it. What did you think of Buffalo Bill as a villain? Do you see him as more terrifying than Hannibal Lecter, or does Lecter's cold, calculating nature overshadow Bill's chaos? Moving on from the characters, let's dive into the technical side of The Silence of the Lambs. Jonathan Demme's direction plays a huge role in how this film delivers its tension and psychological impact. The use of close-ups, in particular, is one of the film's signature techniques. Throughout the movie, we get these extreme close-ups of the characters' faces, especially during the conversations between Clarice and Lecter. These shots make the viewer feel like they're trapped in these intense, intimate exchanges, much like how Clarice must feel being trapped under Lecter's gaze. The cinematography by Tak Fujimoto is another standout element. The film's color palette is subdued and dark, creating a sense of unease throughout. The lighting, especially in the scenes with Lecter, often casts harsh shadows, giving the impression that something is lurking just out of sight, even when it's not. The visual style of the film complements its psychological depth. Everything feels claustrophobic, tense, and most importantly, unpredictable. Another key element is Howard Shore's score. The music in The Silence of the Lambs is subtle but highly effective. It's not a bombastic score, it's one that creeps in, adding layers of unease without overwhelming the scene. It heightens the tension without ever telling the audience what to feel. Shore's music works as an undercurrent to the psychological horror playing out on screen, making us feel the dread without necessarily hearing it in an obvious way. Jonathan Demme made some bold choices in directing The Silence of the Lambs, especially when it comes to pacing. The film moves slowly, deliberately building suspense instead of relying on cheap thrills. There's no rush to get to the action. Demme understands that the real horror lies in the anticipation, in the psychological games being played. By allowing scenes to breathe, particularly those between Clarice and Lecter, Demme lets the tension simmer, which makes the moments of actual violence or terror hit that much harder. One of my favorite examples of this slow burn approach is the famous quid pro quo scene between Clarice and Lecter. Demme allows the scene to unfold gradually, with long pauses between Lecter's questions and Clarice's answers. It's like watching a chess match between two master players, each trying to outmaneuver the other. The tension is palpable, and it's all thanks to Demme's restraint and confidence in his actors. If you're a fan of Demme's directing style, let me know what specific moments stood out to you. Was it his use of close-ups, his pacing, or something else entirely? Now, let's talk a bit more about Howard Shore's score. As I mentioned, it's understated but incredibly effective. One of the reasons it works so well is that it mirrors the tension in the film without overpowering it. The music often fades into the background, but it's always there, lurking like a shadow. Take the scene where Clarice is walking through the dark, dingy basement of Buffalo Bill's house. The score in that moment is almost imperceptible at first, just a few eerie notes here and there. But as the tension rises and Clarice realizes she's in danger, the music swells ever so slightly. It never becomes bombastic, but it subtly amplifies the fear that's already present in the scene. Shore's use of strings in particular adds an unsettling quality to the score. The music feels taut, like it could snap at any moment, which mirrors the emotional and psychological strain the characters are under. This restraint is what makes the score so effective. It never tries to dictate how you should feel, but instead enhances the feelings that the film is already evoking. Now that we've explored the characters, themes, and technical aspects of the film, let's talk about its lasting impact on pop culture and the genre of psychological thrillers. The Silence of the Lambs is one of only a handful of films to win the Big Five Academy Awards: Best Picture, Best Director, Best Actor, Best Actress, and Best Adapted Screenplay. It was a massive achievement for a film that's technically a horror thriller, a genre that rarely gets such recognition from the Academy. But beyond its critical success, the film has left an indelible mark on pop culture. Hannibal Lecter has become one of the most iconic villains in cinema history. Lines like, "I ate his liver with some fava beans and a nice Chianti," have been quoted and parodied countless times, cementing Lecter's place in the pantheon of great film characters. The film also paved the way for more psychological thrillers and horror films to be taken seriously by critics and audiences alike. Before The Silence of the Lambs, horror was often dismissed as lowbrow or exploitative. This film showed that horror could be smart, sophisticated, and emotionally resonant. What do you think? Has The Silence of the Lambs influenced other films or TV shows you love? I can think of countless examples, from César to True Detective. Let me know your thoughts. As me and a few friends were watching this movie, we had some questions that I think would be interesting to answer here and get your opinion. One question was, is Hannibal Lecter actually the hero of the story, in a strange way, because he helps catch Buffalo Bill? In a way, Lecter does play an anti-hero role because he helps Clarice catch Buffalo Bill. But I wouldn't go so far as to call him a hero. His motivations are always self-serving. He helps Clarice not out of any moral obligation, but because he finds her fascinating and wants to see how far he can push her. Lecter may assist in capturing a worse monster, but that doesn't absolve him of his own horrific actions. In fact, his assistance comes with a price. He's constantly manipulating Clarice and the FBI for his own ends. In the end, he's a deeply selfish and dangerous individual who thrives on chaos and psychological torment. So, while Lecter's involvement does lead to the capture of Buffalo Bill, he's not a hero in the traditional sense, but rather a wild card in the story's moral landscape. Another interesting question is, does Clarice's childhood trauma of hearing the lambs screaming plays a bigger role in her decision-making than we see in the film? I think Clarice's past definitely plays a huge role in shaping who she is as a character and why she's so determined to save Buffalo Bill's victims. The lambs are a metaphor for the innocence that she feels she couldn't protect when she was a child, and now as an adult, she's driven by this need to silence those screams, to save someone, and in doing so, save a part of herself. I think this trauma informs a lot of her decisions, especially when she decides to enter Buffalo Bill's house alone in the final act. She's determined to stop the cycle of violence and save Catherine, just as she couldn't save the lambs. It's almost like she sees this case as her chance for redemption, to prove to herself that she can be a protector. Something I didn't notice at first was the cinematography during Buffalo Bill's scenes. She noticed the lighting was very different compared to the scenes with Hannibal Lecter. To this, I think the lighting and cinematography in The Silence of the Lambs are carefully crafted to reflect the psychological states of the characters. In the scenes with Hannibal Lecter, the lighting is often very stark and clinical, with a lot of shadows, especially in his cell. This creates a cold, intellectual atmosphere that mirrors Lecter's manipulative and calculated nature. He's in control of his environment, and the lighting reflects that sense of power and precision. On the other hand, the scenes with Buffalo Bill are much grittier, darker, and more chaotic. His basement is dimly lit, with a sort of dirty, yellowish hue that makes everything feel grimy and claustrophobic. It's almost as if we're descending into the underworld when we enter his space. The lighting feels oppressive and disorienting, much like Buffalo Bill himself. He's unpredictable, and the cinematography captures that sense of unease. It's almost as if we're watching two different kinds of horror, the cold, calculated terror of Lecter and the raw, animalistic violence of Bill. Both are terrifying in their own way, but the lighting helps distinguish their respective brands of evil. Now, the last question: would the movie have the same impact if it were released today, with the current state of crime thrillers and psychological horror? I'd argue that The Silence of the Lambs would still have a massive impact today, even in a world saturated with crime thrillers and psychological horror. The reason is that the film isn't just about shock value or gore, it's about character, atmosphere, and the slow psychological build-up of tension. It's a masterclass in creating suspense without relying on cheap tricks, which is something that never goes out of style. What sets The Silence of the Lambs apart from many modern thrillers is the depth of its characters, particularly in the way it explores the minds of both the hunter and the hunted. Clarice is a fully realized character with vulnerabilities and strengths, and Lecter, as I've mentioned before, is so much more than a stock villain. A lot of modern crime thrillers tend to focus more on the procedural aspect, the chase, the forensics, the twists, whereas The Silence of the Lambs is more of a psychological game. However, I do think the film would have to adapt to some of the changes in our understanding of serial killers and psychology. Our understanding of mental illness has evolved since the film's release, and there would likely be more nuanced portrayals of some aspects of Buffalo Bill's character, particularly regarding his identity and motivations. But in terms of raw suspense and character-driven storytelling, I think The Silence of the Lambs would still stand out, even in today's crowded landscape. Let's now shift gears a bit and talk about the cultural impact of The Silence of the Lambs and how it influenced not only film, but also television, literature, and the broader media landscape. This movie set the bar incredibly high for psychological thrillers, and you can see its influence in countless works that came after. We already mentioned how it opened the door for psychological horror to be taken more seriously, but I want to dig deeper into how it specifically influenced some of the most iconic films and shows that followed. For instance, it's impossible to watch a show like True Detective without seeing echoes of The Silence of the Lambs in its structure, tone, and themes. The dark, twisted psychological elements, the exploration of evil, and the methodical pace all feel like an extension of the groundwork laid by The Silence of the Lambs. Even films like Seven owe a debt to Demi's masterpiece. Seven took the psychological thriller to even darker places, but it's clear that the careful balance of detective work and psychological horror was directly influenced by The Silence of the Lambs. David Fincher's use of lighting and atmosphere in Seven Mirrors, Tak Fujimoto's work in The Silence of the Lambs, particularly in creating environments that feel oppressive and unsettling, where evil seems to lurk around every corner. We also can't ignore how The Silence of the Lambs shaped portrayals of criminal profiling and the FBI in media. Shows like Criminal Minds and Mindhunter owe a huge debt to the way this film depicted the work of behavioral analysts and profilers. Clarice Starling's character helped pave the way for a whole new subgenre of crime dramas focused on understanding the psychology of killers rather than just catching them through traditional detective work. And let's not forget the immense impact it had on the horror genre itself. Films like The Babadook, Hereditary and Midsommar have all drawn on the idea that true horror often comes from within. These films, much like The Silence of the Lambs, explore how personal trauma and deep-seated fears can manifest in ways that are far more terrifying than any external monster. As we near the end of our deep dive into The Silence of the Lambs, I want to reflect on why this film has endured for over 3 decades. It's a film that, despite its terrifying subject matter, resonates on a deeply human level. Yes, it's about serial killers and horrifying crimes, but at its core, it's about fear. Personal fear, societal fear, and the fear of powerlessness. The reason it stays with us is that it taps into those universal fears we all share. For Clarice Starling, the fear is rooted in her past and in her desire to prove herself in a world that constantly tries to undermine her. For Hannibal Lecter, fear is a tool he uses to manipulate those around him. And for Buffalo Bill, fear manifests in his horrifying attempts to reshape his identity. Each character reflects a different facet of fear, and that's what makes this film so endlessly fascinating. If you haven't revisited The Silence of the Lambs recently, I encourage you to do so. It's a film that only grows richer with each viewing, as you pick up on new details, new layers of psychological depth. It's a film that challenges you to look beyond the surface and confront the darker aspects of human nature. I'd love to hear your final thoughts before we wrap up. What's your take on The Silence of the Lambs after all these years? Has it aged well? Does it still hold up as one of the best psychological thrillers of all time? Thank you for tuning in to this episode of the End of Reason podcast. I hope you enjoyed this deep dive into The Silence of the Lambs. As always, if you liked what you heard, make sure to subscribe and leave us a review. Your feedback helps us bring more in-depth analyses of your favorite films. Until then, I'm CR Knight. Stay curious, stay fearless, and keep questioning everything.